What would make a prince leave his home without a word? No statement, no denial, no reassurance, just silence. Not a press conference. Not a carefully worded legal notice, not even a vague sources close to the couple leak, just absence. Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. And sometimes, absence is the loudest thing in the room. For weeks, Montecito had been sold to the public as calm, sunlit, serene, a refuge built on fresh starts and carefully curated distance from the chaos of palace life, a place where the noise was supposed to stop, where the story was supposed to end. Instead, it followed them, because when the latest allegations erupted, whispered first, then amplified, then screamed across social media, something shifted. The tone changed, the headlines sharpened, and suddenly, the narrative wasn't just about reputation anymore, it was about escape. Why would Prince Harry leave Montecito at the exact moment the media storm reached its peak? Why now? Why quietly? And why did the timing feel deliberate? Before we go any further, let's be clear about one thing. This story is not about proven facts. It's about allegations, claims, rumors, media narratives, and more importantly, it's about what those narratives do to people when they spin out of control. Because in the modern media age, truth often arrives last, if it arrives at all. What arrives first is spectacle. And this spectacle came loaded with everything the internet loves most: old grudges, familiar enemies, blurred lines between opinion and reporting, and a storyline so provocative that people didn't ask whether it made sense. They asked how fast they could share it. At the center of it all stood Meghan. At the edge of it all stood Harry. And circling the entire situation was a media ecosystem that thrives on conflict, not clarity. Here's the uncomfortable reality most people don't want to confront. Allegations don't need proof to cause damage. They don't need verification to travel. They don't even need logic, only repetition. And once a story reaches a certain velocity, it no longer belongs to the people it's about. It belongs to the audience consuming it. So ask yourself something honestly. When you first heard whispers of this scandal, did you pause? Did you ask who benefits? Or did the headline alone already do its job? That's not an accusation. It's human nature. Because stories like this are designed to bypass skepticism and go straight for emotion, shock, betrayal, irony, the thrill of watching a public figure fall, or fight, or flee, and flee is the word many commentators latched onto. Prince Harry flees Montecito. Flees implies fear. Flees implies guilt. Flees implies something to hide. But does it? Or does it imply something else entirely? This is where the story gets complicated, because Harry has a long documented history with the press that predates Meghan entirely. A history shaped by trauma, intrusion, and a mother whose life became a cautionary tale about what happens when the media refuses to stop. So when people saw reports of him leaving Montecito, they projected meaning onto the act. Some saw abandonment, some saw panic, some saw a marriage cracking under pressure, others saw strategy, and the loudest voices, they didn't see nuance at all. They saw opportunity to reframe an old conflict as a new scandal, opportunity to revive unresolved feuds, opportunity to turn speculation into spectacle. And that's how one allegation, never substantiated, endlessly repeated, began to mutate into something far bigger than itself. Because this wasn't just about a rumor. It was about timing. The timing of renewed media interest. The timing of public fatigue with the Sussexes narrative. The timing of personalities who had been waiting years to reinsert themselves into the conversation. And suddenly, an old rivalry collided with a new digital megaphone. Ask yourself this. If these allegations had surfaced 5 years ago, would they have landed the same way? If they had surfaced without social media's amplification, would they have survived a single news cycle? Probably not. But today, outrage travels faster than evidence, and silence, especially from public figures, is interpreted as confession. That's the trap. Because when Meghan didn't respond, critics said she was hiding. When Harry didn't respond, critics said he was running. No response became the story. But what if silence wasn't surrender? What if it was survival? This is where we need to slow down and look at the emotional terrain beneath the headlines. Imagine waking up to see your life reframed overnight, your marriage dissected by strangers, your intentions rewritten by people who have never met you, your past dragged forward, reshaped, and weaponized. Now imagine knowing that anything you say will be clipped, twisted, monetized, and replayed endlessly. Would you speak, or would you leave? Harry's departure from Montecito, temporary or not, was immediately loaded with symbolism. Commentators filled the vacuum with speculation. Was he alone? Was it a break? Was it a crisis meeting? Was it legal advice? Was it emotional collapse? Notice something important here. Every theory says more about the storyteller than the story itself, because none of those voices were in the room. But the audience didn't wait for confirmation. They chose sides, they filled in blanks. They turned possibility into certainty. That's the power of narrative momentum. And once momentum takes hold, it becomes almost impossible to stop, especially when familiar antagonists step back into the spotlight. Because this story didn't emerge in a vacuum. It tapped into years of unresolved tension between Meghan and parts of the British media. Tension that never truly cooled, only went quiet. And when it resurfaced, it didn't come back gently. It came back sharpened, rebranded as questions, framed as commentary, shielded by phrases like allegedly and some are saying. But make no mistake, language like that doesn't reduce impact. It increases it, because it invites the audience to connect dots themselves. And once people do that, they feel ownership over the conclusion. That's why this story spread so fast. It didn't tell people what to think. It let them think they figured it out. And Harry's silence became the final piece in a puzzle people were eager to complete. But here's the contradiction no one wanted to sit with. If Harry truly wanted to protect his family from media harm, leaving the epicenter of speculation would be the most consistent action he could take. So why was that framed as guilt instead of self-preservation? Why does leaving equal fleeing, but staying would have been called defiance? That double standard sits at the heart of this entire saga, because no matter what choice is made, the narrative punishes it. And that's when personal crises stop being personal at all. They become public property. This is why this story matters now, not because of the allegation itself, but because of what it reveals about how easily modern audiences are pulled into unverified drama. Because if a prince with resources, lawyers, and global visibility can be swallowed by rumor, what chance does anyone else have? And maybe that's the most unsettling part. That this isn't really a royal scandal. It's a case study. A case study in how quickly reality gets replaced by engagement, in how silence is interpreted as weakness, in how leaving a house becomes a headline that overshadows everything else. And we haven't even reached the moment when this media storm fully ignited, because behind the scenes, something else was happening, something quieter, something that didn't trend, but changed the trajectory of the story entirely. And once that piece comes into focus, the question won't be why Harry left. The question will be what finally pushed him to go. But what came next would change everything, and no one saw it coming. You don't leave quietly when everything is fine. You don't disappear from your own narrative unless something is chasing you. And yet, that's exactly what happened next. In the hours after the allegations began gaining real traction, not whispers anymore, not niche forums, but mainstream circulation, Prince Harry was suddenly gone. No photos, no casual sightings, no planted reassurance leaks. Just a noticeable absence from the very place that had been marketed as his sanctuary. Montecito. The name alone had become shorthand for reinvention, for escape, for control. It was supposed to be the final chapter after the palace, after the lawsuits, after the interviews, after the noise. So when reports surfaced that Harry had left the area, people didn't ask where he went first. They asked why, and more importantly, they asked what broke. Here's the thing most headlines didn't slow down enough to examine. Harry leaving Montecito wasn't dramatic on its own. People travel, people take breaks, people step away. But in the context of this story, this timing, it felt loaded. Because nothing about the moment was neutral. The allegations were still forming, still mutating. The narrative hadn't even settled yet, and already commentators were framing his movement as reaction, as response, as consequence. That's how fast conclusions were drawn. One day, the story was speculation. The next, his absence was treated as confirmation. And suddenly, Montecito wasn't a home anymore. It was a crime scene in the court of public opinion. Let's pause here and ask something uncomfortable. If Harry had stayed, What would the narrative have been? That he was hiding behind gates? That he was refusing to face questions? That he was defiantly ignoring the public? There was no version of staying that would have been read kindly, so leaving became the only action he could take, and the one that would still be weaponized. That contradiction sits at the heart of this entire chapter, because what looked like flight to some looked like strategy to others. And strategy matters. Harry has spent years in legal battles with media organizations. He understands optics. He understands how quickly a story hardens. He understands that once a narrative becomes visual, photos, grainy shots, exclusive sightings, it gains legitimacy it doesn't deserve. By removing himself physically, he removed one thing the media thrives on: imagery. No pictures meant no visual confirmation of panic, anger, or collapse. But absence also creates space for speculation. And that space was immediately filled. Within hours, social media accounts began posting timelines. Armchair analysts dissected flight paths, calendars, past behavior. Comment sections exploded with certainty, masquerading as analysis. He's running, he's done, this is the beginning of the end. But certainty without evidence is just storytelling, and storytelling is what the internet does best. What most people missed was how consistent this behavior actually was with Harry's past. When pressure peaks, he retreats. When noise overwhelms, he removes himself. Not forever, not dramatically, just enough to breathe. He did it after Afghanistan. He did it during previous media storms. He did it long before Meghan ever entered the picture. But context gets erased when it doesn't fit the preferred narrative. And the preferred narrative here was collapse. Because collapse sells. A prince fleeing his mansion is a better headline than a man taking space. But behind the sensational framing was a quieter truth. Montecito had become unsafe, not physically, but narratively. Every movement was being tracked. Every silence interpreted. Every decision distorted. And the allegations had added gasoline to an already smoldering fire. What made this moment different wasn't just the rumor itself. It was how quickly it connected to old resentments. Old media grudges, old public skepticism, old fatigue with the Sussex story. People were primed to believe the worst. And once belief sets in, evidence becomes optional. That's when Harry's exit stopped being a personal decision and became a symbol. A symbol of guilt to critics, a symbol of self-preservation to supporters, a symbol of instability to commentators. Same action, three interpretations. That alone should make anyone cautious. But caution doesn't trend. Drama does. And the drama escalated when unnamed sources began filling the vacuum Harry left behind. Sources who claimed insight, sources who claimed concern. Sources who conveniently aligned with whatever outlet they were speaking to. None of them on record. All of them confident. This is where the story took its first dangerous turn. Because once sources start speaking for someone who is silent, they effectively overwrite that person's voice. Harry didn't say he was leaving because of the allegations. But others were more than happy to say it for him, and once that explanation exists, it spreads faster than any correction ever could. Ask yourself this: have you ever seen a rumor fully undone once it reaches critical mass? Exactly. That's why timing matters so much here. Harry left before the story crystallized, before legal responses, before formal statements, before the narrative solidified. That suggests anticipation, not panic. It suggests someone who knows how this machine works. But anticipation doesn't stop interpretation, and the interpretation leaned dark. Some commentators framed the move as marital tension. Others framed it as emotional collapse. Still others framed it as preparation for something worse: divorce, separation, confession. None of them had proof, but proof wasn't required because the audience was already emotionally invested. This is where the emotional beats hit hardest. Imagine being Harry in that moment. You've spent years saying the press is dangerous. You've spent years saying narratives kill. You've spent years being told you're exaggerating. And now you're watching a story form in real time, one you know you can't control. Do you engage and risk amplifying it? Do you deny and give it oxygen? Or do you step away and protect what little mental ground you have left? There is no winning move. And that's what makes this chapter so revealing. Because the idea of fleeing assumes fear. But fear of what? Fear of truth coming out? Or fear of lies spreading unchecked? Those are very different fears. And only one aligns with Harry's history: Throughout his adult life, he has reacted most strongly not to criticism, but to intrusion, the feeling of being hunted, the feeling of being misrepresented, the feeling of watching strangers profit from pain. That's the pattern. And yet, this time, the pattern was recast as weakness. Why? Because this story had already been emotionally framed against him. That framing didn't come from facts. It came from familiarity. People thought they knew how this story would end. They thought they'd seen this movie before, but they hadn't. Because what no one could see yet was how fragile this narrative actually was, how many assumptions it relied on, how many leaps it made, how many gaps it refused to examine. Harry's absence became the loudest sound, but it wasn't the most important development. The most important development was happening elsewhere, quietly, in commentary, in opinion columns, in the tone of coverage shifting from curiosity to accusation. And one voice in particular began to cut through the noise, not with restraint, but with certainty. A voice that had been waiting years for a moment like this, because for some commentators, this wasn't just another story. It was unfinished business. And when that voice re-entered the conversation, the narrative didn't just intensify, it polarized. But before we get there, we need to understand something crucial. Harry leaving Montecito wasn't the end of the story. It was the signal that the story had crossed a threshold, from rumor to reckoning, from speculation to spectacle. And once that threshold is crossed, there's no going back to just talk. The machine doesn't slow down, it accelerates. And the next chapter is where that acceleration becomes impossible to ignore. Because the conflict wasn't just between Harry and the media anymore. It was about to become personal, and old enemies were about to step back into the spotlight. But what happened next would turn a messy rumor into a full-blown media war, and the tone would never be the same again. This didn't start in Montecito. That's the part almost everyone gets wrong. The moment the story exploded, it was framed as sudden, an unexpected eruption, a shocking twist, a scandal out of nowhere. But if you zoom out just slightly, the pattern becomes impossible to ignore. This wasn't a spark. It was a flare-up, because long before the latest allegations ever entered the public bloodstream, there was already a fault line running beneath this entire narrative. A fault line built on resentment, unresolved grudges, and years of media combat that never truly ended, only went quiet. Ask yourself this: why did this rumor feel instantly believable to so many people? Not proven, not verified, just believable. That doesn't happen by accident. It happens when an audience has been conditioned. To understand why, you have to go back, not to the allegation, but to the environment that made it feel plausible. From the moment Meghan entered the royal orbit, she wasn't just covered. She was framed. Framed as disruptive. Framed as calculating. Framed as inauthentic. And while criticism comes with public life, what followed went beyond scrutiny. It became narrative fixation. Every gesture decoded, every silence pathologized. Every expression treated like evidence. And standing beside her was Prince Harry, a man already carrying a complicated relationship with the press long before she arrived. Harry's distrust of media didn't begin with marriage. It began with loss. He grew up watching cameras chase his mother, watching speculation harden into judgment, watching narratives replace reality until there was no separating the two. So when he said the press was dangerous, he wasn't theorizing, he was remembering. That history matters because it shaped every move he made later, and every move was interpreted through that lens. But here's where things get more volatile. Not all media hostility is the same. There's criticism, there's commentary, and then there's personalization. And personalization is where this story turns sharp. Certain commentators didn't just critique Meghan's actions, they critiqued her character, her intentions, her authenticity as a human being. And once criticism becomes personal, it doesn't fade. It calcifies. It waits. This is where old media rivalries come back into focus. Because some voices never accepted the boundary Meghan tried to draw between her private life and public role. And when that boundary was enforced, resentment followed. Resentment that simmered quietly until the perfect moment arrived. That moment didn't come with proof. It came with opportunity. Opportunity created by timing, by public fatigue, by a narrative environment already primed to see conflict where none had been established. And one of the loudest voices to seize that opportunity belonged to Piers Morgan. To be clear, this chapter isn't about assigning guilt or validating allegations. It's about understanding amplification. Morgan's role in this saga isn't about reporting facts, it's about influence, about tone, about how certainty, delivered confidently, can outweigh evidence in the public mind. He didn't need to prove anything, he needed only to speak, because his history with Meghan Markle was already known, already emotional, already unresolved. That's what made his commentary so combustible. Audiences weren't just hearing an opinion, they were hearing a continuation of a long-running feud. And feuds don't require proof to feel real, they require memory. Viewers remembered the tension, they remembered the confrontations, they remembered the anger, so when Morgan leaned into the story, the allegation didn't feel new. It felt like confirmation of something people thought they already knew. That's the dangerous power of pre-existing narratives. They don't need facts to survive, they need reinforcement. And reinforcement came fast. Opinion segments blurred into news summaries. Speculation was framed as reasonable doubt. Language like, "questions must be asked," replaced evidence. This is how media hostility evolves. It stops being about what happened. It becomes about what feels true. And feeling is a terrible substitute for fact. But it's incredibly effective. Here's a contradiction worth sitting with. If Meghan had responded immediately, critics would have said she was defensive. Because she didn't respond, critics said she was hiding. If Harry spoke, he would be accused of controlling the narrative. Because he didn't speak, he was accused of running. There is no winning configuration once hostility reaches this stage, and that's exactly why this moment mattered so much. Because the allegations didn't just surface. They landed on prepared ground softened by years of adversarial coverage, unresolved media battles, and a public increasingly comfortable with consuming scandal as entertainment. Ask yourself something honestly. If this allegation involved someone else, someone without years of hostile framing, would it have traveled this far, this fast? Or would it have been laughed off as implausible gossip? That question exposes the real engine of this story. Bias doesn't need to be conscious to be powerful. It just needs to be consistent. And consistency had been building for years. That's why Morgan's involvement didn't feel intrusive to his supporters. It felt inevitable. To them, he wasn't reviving a feud, he was continuing a conversation that never ended. And that continuation gave the allegation weight it didn't earn on its own. Because now it wasn't just some are saying, it was a familiar critic believes. And belief, especially from a loud, confident voice, often replaces verification in the minds of audiences. But here's the part that complicates everything. Morgan wasn't just reacting to the story. He was shaping it by choosing language, by choosing emphasis, by choosing certainty over caution. And once that tone entered the ecosystem, other outlets followed, because outrage is contagious. One sharp opinion makes another necessary, and suddenly the story isn't about whether something happened. It's about how people feel about the people involved. That's when the line between reporting and retaliation disappears. And that's why this chapter matters, because it reveals how a long history of media hostility can turn an unproven allegation into a cultural moment. Not because it's true, but because it fits. Fits a story people have been told for years. Fits a villain they've already accepted. Fits a conflict they're emotionally invested in seeing resolved, even if resolution means destruction. This is where Harry's silence takes on new meaning. He wasn't just stepping away from a rumor, he was stepping away from a machine that had already decided how this story would be told. And that machine doesn't pause to ask if it's fair. It asks if it's clickable. It asks if it's shareable. It asks if it will keep people watching. And it succeeded, because while critics debated, supporters defended, and commentators escalated, the allegation became secondary. The real story became the war around it. A war of tone, a war of credibility, a war of who gets to define reality. And wars like that don't de-escalate on their own. They require something else to happen, something that forces the narrative to change, something that introduces doubt, something that exposes how allegations are actually born, not in truth, but in repetition. And that's exactly where this story goes next. Because once you understand how rumors are manufactured in the modern media age, this entire saga starts to look very different. And once that understanding sets in, the question won't be who's guilty, it will be who's profiting. But what came next would reveal how easily speculation becomes spectacle, and why stopping it is almost impossible once it starts. Here's the uncomfortable question most people never stop to ask. Who actually starts a scandal? Not who repeats it, not who comments on it, but who lights the match. Because by the time a headline reaches your screen, the story has already been shaped, filtered, sharpened, and repackaged for maximum reaction. What you're seeing isn't the beginning, it's the final form. And in this case, the final form arrived fully weaponized. The moment the allegation entered public space, it didn't arrive alone. It arrived with language already attached to it, tone already decided, suspicion already implied. That's how modern allegations work. They don't say, "This happened." They say, "People are asking questions." They don't say, "Here's evidence." They say, "Sources suggest." And that phrasing matters more than most people realize. Because once a question is asked publicly, the burden shifts. Suddenly, silence becomes suspicious. Denial becomes defensive. And demanding proof feels almost impolite. Think about that for a second. When did skepticism become optional? The answer is simple and unsettling. When outrage became profitable, the digital media ecosystem rewards speed over accuracy and emotion over verification. Allegations don't need to be airtight, they just need to spark engagement. And engagement thrives on ambiguity. Ambiguity invites participation. People don't just read ambiguous stories. They complete them. They fill in blanks with their own biases, experiences, and assumptions. And once they've done that, the story feels personal. That's when it spreads. This is why allegations rarely start as declarations. They start as whispers framed as curiosity. Is it possible that, why hasn't anyone explained? Could this be connected to? Each question plants a seed, and once planted, it grows whether it's watered by truth or not. In this case, the seed didn't fall on neutral ground. It fell into an environment already conditioned to distrust Meghan and scrutinize Harry. Years of adversarial framing had softened the soil. The audience was primed. So when the allegation appeared, it didn't feel like an intrusion. It felt like confirmation. That's the most dangerous moment in any scandal cycle. The moment when people stop asking if something is true and start asking why it took so long to come out. Ask yourself honestly. When you first saw the headline, did you think, "Where's the evidence?" Or did you think, "I knew something like this would happen"? That reaction isn't accidental. It's engineered. Here's how the process typically unfolds. First, a claim surfaces in a low-risk environment, not a major outlet, not a front-page report, a comment, a rumor, a vague post, something deniable. Then it gets repeated, not verbatim, but paraphrased. Each repetition strips context and adds certainty. By the time it reaches a mainstream platform, it no longer sounds like speculation. It sounds like consensus. Next comes the commentary phase. This is where opinion hosts, pundits, and social media personalities step in. They don't verify, they react. They analyze the implications rather than the facts. And in doing so, they legitimize the claim without endorsing it outright. They're just discussing it. That distinction is crucial because it allows people to spread allegations while maintaining plausible deniability. I'm not saying it's true. I'm just saying it raises questions. I'm just reacting to what's out there. But what's out there only exists because someone put it there. This is how the cycle sustains itself. No one claims ownership. No one carries responsibility. But everyone benefits from the attention. And attention is the currency here. The more provocative the claim, the faster it travels. The more emotionally charged the framing, the deeper it embeds. And once the audience is emotionally invested, correction becomes almost impossible. Because corrections don't trigger dopamine. Outrage does. This is why even debunked stories continue to circulate. The emotional memory outlives the factual one. Now add celebrity to this equation. Add fame, history, and unresolved public tension. Add a marriage that's been scrutinized from day one. Add a prince with a known history of media conflict. Add a commentator ecosystem that's been waiting for the next fracture. And suddenly, an allegation doesn't need substance. It needs timing. The timing here was almost perfect. Public interest in the Sussexes had cooled just enough to create hunger for a new angle. Fatigue had set in. Skepticism had hardened. People were ready to believe something different, something darker. That's when the allegation emerged. Not during a high point, not during a media lull, but during a moment of narrative vulnerability. And that's not coincidence. Stories don't go viral because they're true. They go viral because they're useful. Useful to outlets needing clicks, useful to commentators needing relevance, useful to audiences needing stimulation. And once usefulness replaces truth as the primary metric, the story's fate is sealed. This is where Harry's absence intersects with the mechanics of allegation making. Because his silence didn't slow the process. And once imagination takes over, rational analysis exits the room. This is why scandals escalate so quickly. They bypass logic and go straight for identity. Team Meghan. Team Harry. Team I always knew. Team this proves everything. The story becomes a referendum, not an investigation. And that's when it stops being about what happened and starts being about who you believe deserves sympathy. This shift is subtle but powerful, because sympathy is scarce in public scandals. It gets rationed. And once an audience decides who doesn't deserve it, almost anything feels justifiable. That's where the media ecosystem becomes most dangerous. Because it no longer corrects itself, it feeds itself. Outlets cite each other. Commentators react to coverage they helped create. Social media amplifies the loudest interpretations, and the original allegation, whatever it was, gets lost. What remains is momentum. This is the moment Harry seemed to recognize. The moment when leaving Montecito wasn't about avoiding a rumor, it was about stepping out of a machine designed to grind narratives into spectacle. But stepping out doesn't stop the machine. It just removes the human element. And when the human element disappears, the story becomes abstract, easier to distort, easier to exaggerate, easier to consume without empathy. This is why allegations are so powerful in the digital age. They don't need victims or villains to function. They just need attention. And once attention is secured, the cycle repeats. New angles, new commentary, new outrage, until something disrupts it. And disruption rarely comes from facts. It comes from contradiction, from something not fitting, from cracks in the narrative that are too obvious to ignore. Those cracks were already forming, quietly, behind the noise, in the inconsistencies no one wanted to examine yet, because examining them would require slowing down. And slowing down is the one thing this system resists. But that resistance can't hold forever. Because the louder a story gets, the more fragile it becomes. And the next phase of this saga is where that fragility begins to show. Because once the focus shifts from the allegation itself to the person at the center of it, something changes. The scrutiny intensifies. The empathy evaporates. And the cost becomes personal. And in the next chapter, that cost lands squarely on Meghan. Not as a symbol, not as a headline, but as a human being under siege. And once that happens, the story stops being abstract. It becomes deeply, uncomfortably real. But what came next would expose just how quickly public curiosity turns into collective judgment, and why reversing that tide is almost impossible once it starts. Here's the question that changed the temperature of the entire story. What happens when a rumor stops circling and starts pointing? Because until now, the allegations lived in the abstract. They floated between platforms, bounced off commentary, and thrived in implication. They were vague enough to be discussed, but slippery enough to avoid accountability. Then the focus narrowed. And when it did, it landed squarely on Meghan Markle. This is the moment when speculation stops being theoretical and becomes personal. Not because new evidence emerged, not because facts were suddenly verified, but because narratives need a face. And once a face is chosen, empathy becomes optional. The shift was subtle at first. Headlines didn't change much. Commentators kept the same legal language, allegedly, reportedly. Questions remain. But the tone hardened. The language sharpened. The pauses between claims and character disappeared. What had once been framed as a rumor now felt like a verdict waiting to be delivered. Ask yourself something. When stories reach this phase, do you still read them with curiosity? Or do you read them with judgment already loaded? That's the power of narrative momentum. Because Meghan wasn't just being discussed anymore, she was being defined. Defined by people who had never met her. Defined by assumptions built over years. Defined by interpretations of silence, posture, and public perception. And once a person becomes a symbol, the rules change. Symbols don't get the benefit of the doubt. Symbols don't get nuance. Symbols exist to be projected onto. This is where the emotional stakes escalated, because for Meghan, this wasn't a new experience. It was a familiar one, just intensified. From the beginning of her public life alongside Harry, she had been framed as an outsider, as disruptive, as someone whose intentions were suspect by default. And every attempt to correct that narrative had only deepened it. When she spoke, she was accused of manipulating the story. When she didn't, she was accused of hiding. When she appeared confident, she was labeled arrogant. When she appeared vulnerable, she was labeled calculating. There was no neutral ground. And now, with these allegations circulating, that dynamic went into overdrive. The commentary stopped asking what had happened and started asking what kind of person would do something like this. That question is loaded because it assumes the conclusion before the premise. It turns a rumor into a psychological profile. And that's where things become dangerous. Public scandals often pretend to be about behavior, but they're really about character, about deciding who someone is at their core. Once that decision is made, every action gets reinterpreted to support it. A smile becomes smirking. Silence becomes scheming. Distance becomes deceit. This is what it means to be at the center of a storm. Not just being talked about, but being talked over. And while the internet dissected every detail, Meghan remained publicly silent. No denial, no clarification, no counterattack. For some, that silence was strategic. For others, it was damning. But here's the contradiction no one wanted to acknowledge. If Meghan had responded, she would have legitimized the allegation by engaging with it. If she didn't respond, she would be accused of evasion. That's not a choice. It's a trap. And traps are easiest to spring when the audience believes they're watching a performance rather than a person. Let's talk about emotional cost. Imagine knowing that millions of strangers are discussing your private life based on speculation. Imagine seeing your name trend alongside words like betrayal and deception. Imagine knowing that any attempt to explain yourself will be filtered through hostility before it ever reaches neutral ears. That kind of pressure doesn't produce clarity, it produces paralysis. This is why silence is so often misunderstood. Silence isn't always strategy. Sometimes it's survival, but survival doesn't play well on camera. And in the absence of Meghan's voice, others filled the space. Some framed her as manipulative. Some framed her as reckless. Some framed her as the architect of her own downfall. Very few paused to ask the most basic question: where is the evidence? That question didn't trend because evidence slows the story down. Evidence introduces doubt. Evidence forces people to reconsider, and reconsideration is the enemy of virality. So instead, the focus shifted to optics. What had Meghan said in the past? How had she behaved in interviews? What did her body language suggest? This is a familiar tactic. When facts are thin, interpretation becomes king. Every past moment is retrofitted to support the present narrative. Innocent interactions become foreshadowing. Normal behavior becomes suspicious in hindsight. It's storytelling masquerading as analysis. And once enough people repeat the same interpretation, it begins to feel inevitable. This is how public opinion gets shaped, not by proof, but by pattern recognition fueled by bias. Here's another uncomfortable truth. Women at the center of scandals are rarely judged on the same scale as men. Their actions are moralized more aggressively. Their intentions are scrutinized more harshly. Their silence is interpreted more cruelly. And Meghan existed at the intersection of several prejudices at once. Celebrity, outsider, woman, American. Each label came with expectations. Each expectation came with penalties. So when the allegation took hold, it wasn't evaluated on its merits. It was evaluated on whether it fit an existing story. And to many critics, it did. That's why the storm intensified instead of burning out. Because the story wasn't being tested, it was being reinforced. And while all of this unfolded publicly, something else was happening privately. The strain wasn't just reputational, it was relational. Because when one partner becomes the lightning rod, the other becomes collateral. Harry's absence from Montecito took on new meaning in this context. Was he giving space to protect her? Was he distancing himself to shield his own mental health? Or was something deeper fracturing behind closed doors? Again, speculation filled the void. And the most damaging speculation wasn't about the allegation itself. It was about the marriage. Commentators began to frame the silence as division, the absence as abandonment, the lack of public unity as proof of private conflict. This is where the story crossed another line. because now it wasn't just Meghan's character under scrutiny, it was the foundation of their relationship. And once that door opens, it doesn't close easily. Every old interview gets replayed. Every past disagreement gets magnified. Every difference gets reinterpreted as incompatibility. The narrative shifts from, did this happen, to was this inevitable? That shift is devastating. Because inevitability erases choice. It suggests that collapse was always coming, that this outcome was written into the relationship from the start. And for critics who had never accepted the marriage in the first place, that framing was irresistible. They didn't need proof. They had prophecy, but prophecy is just bias with hindsight. And while public debate spiraled, Meghan remained quiet, not because she had nothing to say, but because she understood something the commentators didn't. Engagement wouldn't end the story. It would feed it. Every word would be dissected. Every phrase would be questioned. Every emotion would be judged. So she said nothing, and that choice, whether strategic or emotional, became the loudest statement of all. It forced the media to show its hand, to reveal whether it was interested in truth or traction. And what followed answered that question clearly, because instead of slowing down, the coverage intensified. The focus tightened. The language sharpened. And one question began to dominate the conversation, not what happened, but how Harry was reacting. Because if Meghan was the center of the storm, Harry was the pressure gauge. And whatever he did next would determine how this story evolved. Would he defend? Would he deny? Would he retreat further? Or would the silence itself become the final straw? That's where this chapter ends. Because the next phase of this saga isn't about allegations or media mechanics. It's about a man reaching his breaking point. And when that point is reached, decisions get made, not for optics, not for headlines, but for survival. But what Harry did next would shock even those who thought they understood him and force the public to reconsider everything they thought this story was about. There's a moment before every breaking point that looks deceptively calm. From the outside, it doesn't register as collapse. It looks like distance, like quiet, like someone stepping back to think. But internally, it's anything but calm. It's pressure compressing, thoughts looping, old memories resurfacing, and choices narrowing. This is where Prince Harry found himself. And the question everyone kept asking, loudly, relentlessly, was the wrong one. People asked, why isn't he speaking? The real question was, how long had he been holding this together? Because Harry's reaction to this storm didn't begin when the allegations went public. It began long before that, years before, shaped by a lifetime of experiences that taught him one brutal lesson over and over again. When the media decides on a narrative, fighting it head-on rarely ends well. That lesson wasn't theoretical. It was lived. Harry grew up watching stories about his family spiral beyond control. He watched how headlines could dehumanize, how speculation could harden into truth, how a person could become an idea before they were ever allowed to be a human being. So when this story broke, and when it immediately followed a familiar trajectory, something inside him recognized the pattern. This wasn't just another bad news cycle. This was escalation. And escalation demands a different response. Here's where many commentators misread him. They assumed anger would come first. A statement, a rebuttal, a lawsuit threat, something sharp and decisive. But Harry didn't react with fury, he reacted with withdrawal. And withdrawal, in his history, is not weakness. It's a warning sign. When Harry withdraws, it means he's overwhelmed, not confused. It means he's seen this before and knows where it leads. Ask yourself this. If you've spent years telling the world that the media destroys lives, and then you watch a rumor metastasize in real time, how would you respond? Would you step into the fire and hope this time it burns differently? Or would you step away before it consumes everything? This is the contradiction that defines Harry's public image. Critics frame him as impulsive. Supporters frame him as traumatized. Both miss something crucial. He's cautious, painfully cautious, because caution is what trauma teaches. And when the allegations began pulling Meghan into the center of the storm, that caution tipped into alarm. This wasn't just about reputation anymore. It was about safety, mental safety, emotional safety, the kind of safety that can't be restored once it's shattered. Harry has spoken openly in the past about his mental health struggles, about anxiety, about panic, about the toll of public scrutiny. Those weren't abstract admissions. They were warnings. So when this narrative started accelerating, he didn't see a story to be managed. He saw a threat to the one thing he's been trying to protect since walking away from royal life: his family. This is where his breaking point begins to come into focus. Because the pressure wasn't coming from one direction, it was coming from everywhere, from critics demanding accountability, from supporters demanding reassurance, from commentators dissecting every move, from silence itself becoming suspicious. There was no neutral position left, and that's when retreat becomes the only viable option. Harry's departure from Montecito, temporary, quiet, unexplained, wasn't about abandoning responsibility. It was about creating distance. Distance from cameras, distance from commentary, distance from the emotional chaos that was being broadcast into every corner of their lives. But distance is easily misunderstood. To the outside world, it looked like separation. To some, it looked like avoidance. To others, it looked like a marriage under strain. That interpretation hurt more than the allegation itself, because now the narrative wasn't just attacking Meghan, it was prying into their bond. And that's where Harry's composure began to crack. Not publicly, not visibly, internally. Imagine carrying the weight of knowing that anything you say could worsen the storm, and anything you don't say will be used against you. Imagine knowing that defending your partner could amplify the story, but staying silent could be framed as betrayal. That's not a dilemma with a solution. It's a dilemma with consequences. And every path forward leads to loss. This is the moment when the emotional math stops working, because logic can't solve a problem rooted in perception. Harry wasn't just managing a media crisis. He was managing fear. Fear that this story would spiral into something uncontrollable. Fear that Meghan would be further dehumanized. Fear that history would repeat itself in a way he had sworn it never would. That fear is deeply personal. It's tied to memory, to images, to moments he can't undo. And once those memories get triggered, decision-making changes. People don't act for optics. They act for survival. This is why Harry didn't follow the expected script. He didn't leak a counter-narrative. He didn't deploy friendly sources. He didn't appear in public to project unity. He disappeared. And that disappearance wasn't accidental. It was deliberate. A pause. A chance to breathe before the next move. But here's the cruel irony. In modern media culture, pausing looks like guilt. Silence reads as admission. Distance reads as fracture. Self-protection reads as collapse. And commentators leaned into that interpretation with enthusiasm. They began asking whether Harry was finally seeing something he had ignored before, whether this scandal was forcing a reckoning, whether loyalty had limits. These questions weren't based on evidence. They were based on appetite, an appetite for betrayal. Because betrayal is the most compelling narrative of all. It transforms complexity into drama. And drama keeps people watching. What almost no one acknowledged was how consistent Harry's behavior actually was. When faced with overwhelming media intrusion, he retreats. When faced with emotional overload, he prioritizes distance. When faced with a threat to his mental health, he chooses removal over confrontation. This pattern didn't begin with Meghan. It began long before, but consistency doesn't matter when people want a twist. So instead of seeing a man reaching his limit, the public saw a prince on the verge of abandoning ship. That misreading did real damage, because it fed into the idea that Harry's silence was a judgment on Meghan, that his absence was a verdict, and that narrative hurt him deeply. Not because it questioned his loyalty, but because it reduced a complex emotional response to a cheap conclusion. Harry wasn't weighing whether to stand by his wife, he was weighing how to protect her without making things worse. That's a far harder calculation, and one that doesn't lend itself to clean answers. Inside this pressure cooker, something shifted. The story stopped being external, it became internal. Decisions had to be made not about statements, but about boundaries. How much exposure is too much? How much silence is sustainable? How long can you live inside a story that won't let you speak? This is where breaking points reveal themselves, not with explosions, but with exhaustion. The kind of exhaustion that makes even the strongest people step back and reassess everything. And that reassessment didn't happen in front of cameras. It happened privately, quietly, away from Montecito. And when Harry stepped away, he wasn't stepping away from Meghan, he was stepping away from a narrative that had turned toxic. But narratives don't like being abandoned. They chase. And while Harry was trying to find footing, the story continued to evolve without him. Others spoke in his absence, others interpreted his silence. Others decided what it meant, and the most dangerous interpretation of all began to take hold. That this wasn't just a media storm, that it was a marriage crisis. That assumption changed everything. Because once the public believes a relationship is cracking, every detail gets reinterpreted through that lens. Distance becomes division. Privacy becomes secrecy. Protection becomes control. And that belief invited a new wave of speculation, more invasive, more personal, more corrosive than anything before. Harry may have stepped away to stop the damage, but the damage found new ways in. And the next chapter is where that pressure reaches a new level. Because as the focus shifts from allegations to the marriage itself, the media stops asking what happened. It starts asking who's to blame. And once blame enters the conversation, there's no neutral ground left. But what happened next would force Harry to confront a reality he had been trying desperately to avoid, and reveal just how fragile the line between protection and separation really is. Here's the question that turned quiet concern into full-blown speculation. What happens to a marriage when the world decides it's a battleground? Not a relationship, not a partnership, a battleground. Because the moment the narrative shifted from allegations to marital strain, the story crossed into far more dangerous territory. It stopped being about something that might have happened and started being about something people wanted to see happen. And that desire changed everything. Up until this point, the coverage had been chaotic but unfocused. Rumors, reactions, commentary, counter-commentary. Loud, yes, but scattered. Now it's sharpened. Now, every headline, every segment, every post carried the same underlying question. Are Harry and Meghan breaking apart? Notice how fast that question replaced all others. Not is this true, not where is the evidence, but what does this mean for their marriage? That shift didn't come from new information. It came from appetite, because the public has always been more fascinated by collapse than by conflict resolution. And when a couple has been as polarizing as Harry and Meghan, the idea of fracture feels like narrative closure to critics and betrayal to supporters. Either way, it keeps people watching. This is how private relationships become public property. Not through consent, through consumption. Every marriage has tension. Every marriage has disagreements. Every marriage has moments of distance. But most marriages are allowed to exist without being interpreted as evidence. Harry and Meghan were not afforded that luxury. Every action was framed as symbolic. Every absence was framed as intentional. Every silence was framed as significant. And suddenly, the story wasn't about an allegation anymore. It was about whether love could survive pressure. This is where the contradiction deepens. The same commentators who accused Meghan of controlling Harry now accused Harry of abandoning Meghan. The same voices who criticized them for presenting a united front now criticize them for appearing separate. There was no configuration that would have satisfied the narrative. Unity would be called performative. Distance would be called division. This is the trap of public marriage. It must be visible enough to reassure, but private enough to appear authentic. And once scrutiny reaches this level, authenticity becomes impossible, because you're no longer living your relationship. You're performing it. Let's talk about what we actually know. We know Harry stepped away physically. We know Meghan remained publicly silent. We know neither issued a joint statement. That's it. Everything else was interpretation. But interpretation filled the gap with confidence. Pundits began discussing sources close to the couple. Anonymous insiders spoke about tension behind the scenes. Body language experts dissected old footage as if archived smiles could suddenly reveal present-day truth. This is where storytelling overtook reality completely. Because instead of asking how couples navigate stress, the media asked how this couple would fail under it. Failure had become the assumed outcome, and assumptions are powerful. They shape how every new detail is received. If Harry traveled alone, it was framed as separation. If Meghan didn't appear publicly, it was framed as isolation. If neither spoke, it was framed as breakdown. But here's the part that rarely gets discussed. Privacy in a crisis is not avoidance. It's protection. Most couples facing intense stress retreat inward. They close ranks, they stop sharing, they focus on stabilizing what matters most. But when you're famous, that instinct gets weaponized. Privacy becomes secrecy. Protection becomes control. Boundaries become red flags. That's what happened here. And it wasn't subtle. Commentators began asking whether Harry's departure was mutual or unilateral, whether it was discussed or sudden, whether it was a break or something more permanent. Those questions didn't come from evidence. They came from projection. Because the public has been trained to see celebrity relationships as narratives with arcs: meet cute, rise, tension, collapse. And once a story enters the tension phase, collapse feels inevitable. This is why so many people believed they were watching the beginning of the end. But inevitability is an illusion. It's hindsight pretending to be foresight. Inside the relationship, the reality was almost certainly far less dramatic and far more complicated. Imagine trying to support your partner while being blamed for their pain. Imagine watching someone you love become the target of a narrative you can't stop. Imagine knowing that every attempt to defend them might make things worse. That's not a movie plot. That's emotional paralysis. Harry's instinct, shaped by trauma, was to remove the threat. Meghan's instinct, shaped by experience, was to starve it of oxygen. Those instincts may look different on the outside, but they don't contradict each other. They complement. The problem is that complementary strategies don't read well to an audience trained to expect drama. So instead, the narrative imposed conflict where there may have been coordination. And once conflict is assumed, every neutral action becomes suspicious. Why aren't they seen together? Why aren't they posting supportive messages? Why hasn't he defended her publicly? Those questions carry an accusation baked into them. They assume that public validation is the only valid form of support. But that assumption ignores reality. Some support happens behind closed doors. Some solidarity is quiet. Some protection looks like absence. But quiet doesn't trend. And closed doors don't generate clicks. So the story leaned louder. Speculation about counseling. Speculation about ultimatums. Speculation about irreconcilable differences. None of it sourced, all of it repeated. This is how public pressure becomes corrosive. Because even if a marriage is stable, constant external doubt can introduce internal strain. Not because the relationship is weak, but because it's human. No couple is immune to being misrepresented millions of times a day. That kind of pressure seeps in. It creates questions that wouldn't exist otherwise. How are we being perceived? Is this silence helping or hurting? Are we protecting each other or making things worse? Those questions don't mean collapse. They mean navigation. But navigation isn't sexy, so the media skipped it. And instead, it leaned into symbolism. Harry away. Meghan quiet. Distance equals division. That equation is simplistic, but effective. It allowed the story to escalate without new facts, and escalation is addictive. Viewers began choosing sides not just on the allegation, but on the relationship itself. Some blamed Meghan for isolating Harry. Some blamed Harry for failing to defend Meghan. Some blamed both for creating a spectacle. Rarely did anyone blame the system feeding on the spectacle. That's how public battlefields are constructed. Not by one dramatic event, by 1,000 interpretations layered on top of each other. And once the battlefield exists, everyone feels entitled to fight on it. This is where the emotional damage deepened, because the story stopped being about what was happening and started being about what people wanted to believe. People who had never accepted the marriage saw validation. People who had invested emotionally felt betrayed. Neutral observers were pulled into choosing sides. And the couple themselves were left navigating a crisis they didn't create, but couldn't escape. This is the cost of living publicly. Your private decisions get judged as public statements. Your coping mechanisms get reframed as evidence. Your relationship becomes a canvas for strangers' opinions. And while all of this unfolded externally, the internal stakes grew heavier. Because at some point, every couple under pressure has to ask a hard question. Are we reacting to the story or letting it dictate our lives? That's not a question answered quickly. It requires space. It requires honesty. It requires boundaries. And boundaries were the one thing this story refused to respect. As the speculation intensified, the coverage lost any pretense of restraint. What began as questions turned into confident assertions, assertions about strain, assertions about distance, assertions about a relationship on the brink. And those assertions began to influence perception more than reality. This is where public narratives become self-fulfilling. Not because they're true, but because they change how people respond. Friends ask different questions. Strangers make different assumptions. The couple themselves feel pressure to perform stability, or accept the collapse others expect. That's the psychological toll no one talks about. Because public breakdowns don't start with fights, they start with exhaustion. Exhaustion from defending something that shouldn't need defending, exhaustion from being misunderstood at scale, exhaustion from knowing that whatever choice you make will be criticized anyway. Harry had reached that exhaustion point, and Meghan was being pushed toward it, not by each other, but by the relentless pressure surrounding them. This is why framing the